Pack your things." "You're done." Colin Warner's voice cracked across the open floor like a whip. A few keyboards stopped clattering. Someone near the window sucked in a breath. For a moment, the hum of the air conditioner was the only sound holding the room together. I didn't flinch. 14 years at Bayrock Systems had taught me the value of silence. Silence makes men like Colin squirm. He expected shock, maybe tears. What he got instead was a small, measured smile. I reached behind my monitor, pulled out a black USB drive, and slipped it into my purse with the same ease a waitress pockets her last tip of the night. That little stick held the unsubmitted vendor escalation update protocols I'd rewritten after Infernet Global's last system overhaul. No one else had seen it. No one else knew the code buried in those files. And Colin. He had just severed his company from the only person who understood the wiring beneath their empire. I packed slowly, deliberately, as if I had all the time in the world. A framed certificate, the tomato-shaped stress ball that had survived 7 years of anxious squeezes, and a cardigan draped over my chair. I slid each item into the cardboard box HR provided, careful not to let my hands shake. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught the interns whispering. One asked, "Is he allowed to say that?" Another muttered, "She doesn't even look upset." They were right. I wasn't. Colin puffed up his chest and strutted back toward his glass-walled office, convinced he'd just won a victory for efficiency. He didn't realize he'd just pulled the keystone out of his own arch. The cracks wouldn't show today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon, the weight of his arrogance would start to bring the whole structure down. I balanced the box against my hip, handed my badge to HR without a word, and walked out 3 minutes before 5. Not an hour more of free labor. Outside, the early evening air of Chicago wrapped around me, cool and sharp. I adjusted the strap of my purse, feeling the USB dig lightly against my side, and stepped toward the train that would take me back to Evanston, already planning the next move. When I first walked into Bayrock's half-finished data center, the floor was nothing but concrete dust and the hum of temporary generators. They gave me a folding chair, a borrowed laptop, and a mandate no one else wanted: vendor compliance. Back then, the flashy jobs were in development or sales. No one cared about the contracts, the clauses, the logs, no one but me. I built the foundation line by line. I created onboarding procedures from scratch, writing protocols that others dismissed as unnecessary bureaucracy. I learned to spot hidden traps in supplier contracts, the kind of clauses that could bankrupt a company if left unchecked. I renegotiated terms quietly, often after hours, shaving millions off service renewals without ever asking for credit. Holidays blurred into conference calls, one Christmas Eve, while my family carved ham and passed plates around the table. I sat alone in the office, rewriting an onboarding protocol to prevent a compliance breach that could have cost us $4.2 million. No one remembered the save. They only remembered that I wasn't there for dessert. To the new wave of executives, I was a relic. Colin liked to mock my binders, thick with notes and tabs, as if paper meant ignorance. What he never understood was that those binders held the keys to every deal Bayrock had ever signed. And inside those deals, stamped with corporate seals and signed off by their own lawyers, my name appeared over and over. Sole escalation officer? I didn't hide the risks. I put them in writing comprehensive reports, presentations, red flags highlighted in bold. I warned them what would happen if they relied too heavily on a single officer. I warned them what would happen if that officer wasn't respected. The reports were ignored. Sometimes they ended up in the shred bin before I even finished my explanation. Speed was their gospel. They wanted shiny charts, upward arrows, instant results. I gave them stability. They called it red tape. I called it survival. Now, walking away from the building with my box of belongings, I knew those discarded warnings hadn't disappeared. They were still there, waiting landmines buried under the polished floor of Bayrock's empire, ready to explode. Last year, during a tedious renewal cycle, I'd managed to slip in the most important change of my career. While the executives fought over budgets and timelines, I sat with the vendors' council, line by line, refining the service authorization addendum. That's where I placed the clause any override or emergency escalation would require my authorization. Not legals, not IT's, not even the CEO's, mine. It wasn't vanity, it was survival. Bayrock had grown so dependent on Infernet Global that one wrong switch could cripple us. 70% of all payment traffic ran through their infrastructure. A misstep in that system wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence for the company's balance sheet. Someone had to hold the line. That someone became me. I didn't bury the clause in fine print. I highlighted it in my summary reports, flagged it in emails, and referenced it in meetings. It passed through legal, stamped and signed. It was there for anyone willing to read. But reading was never Colin's strength. He was too busy sculpting his image of efficiency, mocking anything that slowed him down. To him, my signature was just ink on outdated paperwork. To me, it was the keystone in an arch that held everything above it. When he cut me loose, he believed he'd rid himself of the bottleneck. In truth, he had yanked the keystone from his own arch. The structure might look steady for a while, but gravity doesn't negotiate. It only waits. I walked out of Bayrock's headquarters carrying a cardigan draped over one arm, a box with my stress ball shaped like a tomato, and the weight of 14 years condensed into a single fact. No payment system could move forward without me. As the glass doors closed behind me, I knew Colin hadn't fired an employee. He had severed the only signature keeping his empire upright. By Monday morning, Colin was already basking in the glow of his imagined triumph. He marched into the leadership sink with the swagger of a man who thought the war had been won before the first battle had even started. His laptop screen glowed on the wall slide one in bold Arial font, read, "New Era of Efficiency." Slide 2 was worse, a red arrow shooting skyward, slapped over a bar chart with no data sources, no footnotes, just numbers conjured to impress. He launched into his speech with the confidence of a televangelist. We've cut the fat. We've eliminated bottlenecks. Bayrock is ready for the future. HR clapped politely, their smiles stretched too thin to be real. The sales team nodded as though agreement might spare them from his next outburst. Even operations managed a few forced great work mutters, the corporate equivalent of bowing to a king you knew would fall. But the system doesn't bow. It measures, it records, it doesn't care about theatrics. Somewhere behind Colin's puffed chest and shiny graphs, an early alert pinged reimbursement requests were stalling. A small red flag in the vendor system blinked to life, invisible to him, but not to anyone who bothered to look. Jenna Hollis from Accounts Payable noticed, freshly promoted and still learning how to sit in these meetings without shrinking. She raised her hand. "Excuse me, shouldn't these approvals go through validation?" Her voice quavered, but the question was sound. Colin waved her off with a laugh. "The kind you'd use to dismiss a child asking why the sky is blue. We don't need red tape anymore. We're agile now. Just process it." He turned back to his slides, oblivious to the tension settling over the room. They didn't see a leader. They saw a man cutting brake lines and calling it progress. By the time he closed his laptop with a satisfied grin, the engine was already smoking. And while Colin congratulated himself on his so-called victory, I sat in my Evanston kitchen, watching the vendor alerts line up on my private dashboard like dominoes ready to fall. By Tuesday morning, the cracks began to show. Reimbursements bounced back with error codes, travel invoices sat frozen in limbo, and contractors fired off impatient emails demanding answers, the kind of noise executives hate the sound of money not moving. In the finance bullpen, tension rose with every unanswered request. An engineer, bleary-eyed from a night of troubleshooting, finally muttered, "The gateway's asking for Patricia Beale." My name dropped into the room like a stone into water. Conversation stopped. Fingers hovered above keyboards. For a second, no one knew what to say. Colin broke the silence with a dismissive scoff. "It's a glitch. Fix it." His tone carried the same arrogance he'd wielded against me in front of the floor. But the engineer didn't move. He repeated himself, slower this time, as though clarity might save his career. It's literally coded to request her authorization. Still, Colin waved it away. He couldn't admit that the system was working exactly as designed, because admitting that meant admitting he'd gutted the only safeguard Bayrock had. While that theater played out downtown, I sat at my kitchen table in Evanston with a chipped mug of lukewarm coffee and my laptop open. On my mirrored vendor dashboard, alerts stacked neatly, one after another. Each failed escalation marked with a timestamp and ID number. The dominoes weren't just falling, they were documenting their own collapse. I scrolled through the logs with steady hands. Every denial, every stalled payment, every compliance flag was proof of what I had built, proof that the system wasn't malfunctioning. It was following protocol, and the protocol only listened to me. Colin thought he'd fired a clerk with too many binders. He hadn't realized he'd fired the only person the code itself trusted by the time he understood. The silence of those frozen payments would be louder than any speech he could give. 6 weeks before Colin marched me out, I had stayed late in the office, drafting a report no one wanted to read. It was 42 pages of risk analysis dependencies too concentrated, escalation bottlenecks too narrow, the urgent need for at least 2 backup officers. I backed every warning with case studies, compliance clauses, and financial projections. The next morning, I slid it across Colin's desk. He didn't even skim it. In thick black ink, he scrawled fear-mongering across the cover and dropped it into his trash bin as though months of foresight were nothing more than a scare tactic. Now that same report had resurfaced. HR unearthed it while sorting files for legal discovery. And suddenly, my voice wasn't hysterical. It was evidence. Lawyers whispered in corners, heads tilted toward closed doors, asking each other whether negligence could be pinned on an executive. And in Bayrock's boardroom, directors who had once nodded along with Colin's bravado began to circle, sensing blood. Meanwhile, vendors were losing patience. One halted ongoing services until payment arrived. Another sent a notice threatening legal action. And then came the blow. Bayrock couldn't ignore Infernet Global formally flagged the company as non-responsive to escalation. It was the bureaucratic way of saying, "You're cut off." Clause 6.1 had been triggered, the very clause I had fought to insert. I imagined the boardroom when that notice arrived, executives fumbling for answers, Colin's ears turning red, the same way they did when he realized he was wrong but couldn't admit it. The fuse I'd predicted wasn't theoretical anymore. It was burning faster than even I expected. People would say later that I smiled the day I was fired out of arrogance. They never understood. It wasn't arrogance. It was foresight. I had already seen the firestorm approaching, and now the sparks were visible to everyone. While Bayrock scrambled to contain the fallout, I sat in my Evanston apartment, binder open, laptop humming. The evidence was no longer in question. It was only a matter of how deep the damage would cut. I cleared my kitchen table until only the scratches in the wood remained, then began stacking binders, contracts, and digital printouts in neat rows. 14 years of records sat at my fingertips, each clause highlighted, each amendment annotated. I called it my leverage log. It wasn't dramatic, no secret vault, no cloak and dagger meeting, just me, a pot of coffee going cold, in the kind of order that could bring a corporation to its knees. Clause by clause. I built a package, copies of vendor authorizations, every page where my name was printed as escalation officer, every signature notarized and stamped. When the file was ready, I opened a new email credential continuity. Please confirm receipt. Attached were the documents Bayrock had ignored for years, now compiled into a single weapon. I pressed send to Infernet Global's legal team and leaned back in my chair. For most of my career, invisibility had been my curse. I was the quiet spine behind operations, the one no one saw until something went wrong. But in that moment, invisibility became power. I had slipped beneath their radar for so long that they never imagined I could wield it against them. While I drafted proposals in the dim light of my kitchen, Colin stormed through Bayrock's glass offices. He blamed interns, gaslit managers, barked orders at engineers who were already updating their resumes. His voice might carry across the floor, but his authority was hollow. Every failed payment, every frozen invoice, every escalation locked behind my name proved it. I didn't write proposals to Bayrock. That door was closed forever. Instead, I outlined a consulting agreement addressed to Infernet itself. Terms of engagement, retainer fees, oversight structures this time written to value the expertise they'd once dismissed. I was no longer an employee. I was the firewall they couldn't uninstall, the system they didn't realize they had built their future upon. And as the city outside my window slipped into evening, I knew the next move would not be made in their boardroom. It would be made at my table. By Thursday morning, Bayrock's desperation spilled into an emergency board session. They dialed into a vendor call, hoping for a patch, a workaround, some miracle to keep the lights on. Instead, Elias Grant, CEO of Infernet Global, appeared on the screen. Calm voice, deliberate cadence, every word sharpened by the weight of protocol. He began by reviewing the clause. My clause. The one that required my authorization for every escalation. He didn't rush. He read it word for word, let the silence stretch, then leaned back and laughed. I'm sorry you fired your what? The boardroom froze. Even through second-hand accounts, I could picture it, executives staring at their notepads, Colin shrinking into his chair, the color draining from his face. Melissa Raymond, the external counsel they'd flown in, flipped through a binder thick with signatures. She tapped her pen against the highlighted text, confirmed what I already knew: my authority wasn't optional. It was embedded, biometric-linked, irreplaceable without a 90-day vendor rebuild. The CEO, who had always preferred golf to governance, glared at Colin as though he could will an explanation out of him. But there was nothing to say. Firing me hadn't just bruised compliance. It had triggered a non-compliance hold that locked 70% of Bayrock's revenue streams. Payroll, reimbursements, client contracts. Every pipe was clogged by a signature that no longer existed inside their building. Elias let the board squirm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His laughter still echoed as he reminded them. Infernet does not bypass contracts. We are the contract. I wasn't in that room, but the sound carried across the city. One of the managers later described it to me. The laughter cut through the boardroom like glass, leaving silence heavy enough to drown in. At my kitchen table, I read the transcript forwarded from a friendly contact and sipped coffee gone cold. The moment had finally arrived, the one I'd anticipated the second Colin snapped his order. And now, the weight of his arrogance was collapsing on top of him. By Friday morning, the balance of power had shifted so completely that Bayrock's board could no longer pretend otherwise. Infernet's legal team reached out directly, bypassing every Bayrock channel, and placed an offer squarely in my inbox. A consulting agreement triple my former salary, full autonomy, no set hours, and oversight defined by me alone. They didn't ask if I wanted to come back. They knew better. They offered partnership on my terms. I sat at my kitchen table with the morning light spilling through the blinds. Contract pages spread neatly beside my coffee mug. My cat leapt into the opposite chair, curled into a loaf, and purred as if it knew I was about to reclaim more than a career. The pen in my hand felt heavier than it should. It wasn't just ink waiting to be written, it was acknowledgement. For years, they'd reduced me to a checklist. But the truth was simple. I wasn't the checklist. I was the system. Across town, Colin was pacing in his glass box of an office, muttering half-formed excuses, trying to stitch together stories for a board that had already stopped believing him. Directors no longer asked questions about strategy. They wanted to know one thing: how soon the payment gateways would open again, and Colin had no answer. Excuses don't process reimbursements. Speeches don't release payroll. Only my signature could flip the switch. And the irony wasn't lost on me that the man who'd barked "pack your things" now sat powerless while I decided if the company he thought he controlled deserved to breathe another day. For the first time in years, I didn't rush. I didn't bend to deadlines no one respected. I let them sweat through their weekend calls, their emergency task forces, their silent hallways. The contract sat on my table, waiting, while I savored the quiet. The crown had turned, and it rested in my hands alone. By Monday morning, the inevitable had happened. Colin was gone, escorted out with a resignation letter that was less choice than decree. HR didn't bother with a farewell email. The CEO, once smug and sun-bronzed, looked 10 years older, his voice frayed as he tried to steady a company that was still paralyzed. Bayrock stood frozen, its systems locked in limbo, every invoice and paycheck waiting for the name that no longer lived inside its walls. That same morning, I picked up my pen and signed Infernet's consulting contract. Not as a return, not as a concession, but as a transformation. This wasn't about crawling back into the cage they had shoved me out of. It was about transcending it. I was no longer an employee measured by headcount or mocked for binders. I was an independent force tied directly to the infrastructure itself. Bayrock would now depend on me from the outside, guarded not by obligation, but by leverage, valued, respected, untouchable. The contract closed with a soft click of the laptop. I let the quiet linger before stepping outside. By evening, I was walking along Evanston's lakefront park, the air cool, the water stretching endless across Lake Michigan. My niece skipped at my side, holding a juice box, her hair wild in the wind. She looked up at me and asked, "Did they finally listen?" I let a smile form slowly, the kind that carried both irony and relief. They had no choice. I answered, and that was the truth. The city's skyline glittered across the lake, distant and sharp, a reminder of where I'd been erased and where I'd reclaimed my place. For once, I wasn't invisible. I was the firewall they couldn't delete, the system they couldn't silence. And now, the key was mine alone.